The autumn wind carried more than cold air through Thomas Brennan's barn that October morning. It carried the sound of crying, high and desperate, cutting through the silence he'd wrapped around himself like armor for 3 long years. What he found in the hay, wrapped in a stranger's coat, would crack his heart wide open again. And the note pinned to the blanket would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd loved and lost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high country of western Montana had a way of making a man feel small. Thomas Brennan stood on the porch of his ranch house as the first light of dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of copper and gold. The air smelled of pine smoke and frost. That particular October scent that signaled winter wasn't far behind. He held a tin cup of coffee, gone lukewarm, in his hands, staring out at land that stretched for miles in every direction. 2,000 acres of grass and timber, horses and cattle, fences that needed mending, and a barn that needed painting. All of it is his, all of it empty. Thomas was 34 years old, though most folks said he carried himself like a man much older. His face had been weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused from rope and leather, his eyes the kind of grey that reminded people of winter skies. He wore his hair longer than he should, dark and touched with just enough silver at the temples to make him look distinguished rather than old. But it was his silence that people noticed most. Thomas Brennan didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, and these days he found he had less and less to say at all. 3 years ago his wife Margaret had died, just 28 years old, gone in the space of a single terrible week. Pneumonia, the doctor said, brought on by a winter that came early and cruel. Thomas had sat by her bedside in their small ranch house, holding her hand and watching helplessly as fever consumed her. She'd been the bright thing in his life, the laughter that filled the corners of rooms, the voice that sang while cooking breakfast. When she died, she took all the music with her. He hadn't sold the ranch, though plenty of folks suggested it. His brother-in-law Garrett had come down from Missoula, sat him down at the kitchen table, and said plain as day that a man couldn't run a spread this size alone. That grief would eat him alive if he stayed. But Thomas couldn't leave. Margaret was buried on a hillside overlooking the south pasture beneath a copper beech tree she'd loved. Leaving would mean leaving her, and he wasn't ready for that. Wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. So instead he worked. He worked until his muscles ached and his mind went quiet. He worked through dawn and past dusk, mending fences in spring, cutting hay in summer, moving cattle in fall. He hired a couple of hands when the work got too heavy, but he kept to himself mostly. The ranch hands, 2 brothers named Cole and Danny Westfield, understood without being told. They showed up, did their work, collected their pay, and left Thomas to his solitude. It was an arrangement that suited everyone just fine. The house had grown quieter over the years. Thomas didn't play the radio anymore, didn't keep the lamps burning past nightfall. He ate simple meals, beans and bread mostly, sometimes a piece of meat if he remembered to cook it. He slept in the chair by the fireplace more often than in the bed he'd shared with Margaret. That bed felt too wide now, too cold, and the emptiness beside him was a weight he couldn't bear. So he stayed in the chair, dozing until dawn, then rose and started the whole thing over again. This particular morning felt no different than any other. Thomas drained the last of his coffee, set the cup on the porch rail, and pulled on his work coat. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist that clung to the valley floor. He could see his breath in the air, little clouds of white that vanished as fast as they appeared. Winter was coming. He could feel it in his bones. He walked across the yard toward the barn, boots crunching on gravel. The barn was a sturdy structure, built by his grandfather 50 years ago, with thick timber walls and a roof of weathered shingles. Inside it smelled of hay and leather, horse sweat and old wood. Thomas kept 6 horses, a mix of quarter horses and mustangs he'd broken himself. They nickered softly as he entered, shifting in their stalls, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. He moved through his routine without thinking. Fill the water troughs, measure out the grain, check each horse for signs of injury or illness. It was work his hands knew by heart, work that required no thought, no emotion. He was halfway through mucking out the third stall when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Thomas stopped, pitchfork in hand, and listened. At first he thought it was a cat, maybe a stray that had wandered in looking for warmth. But the sound came again, louder this time, more insistent. Not a cat. Something else, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He set the pitchfork against the wall and walked toward the back of the barn, where the hay was stacked high in the loft. The sound grew louder with each step. Not an animal. No, this was different. This was human. This was a baby crying. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest. He stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if grief had finally driven him mad. But the crying continued, high and desperate and unmistakably real. He climbed the ladder to the loft, moving carefully, his mind racing. Who would leave a baby in a barn? Why here? Why his barn? The loft was dim, lit only by the thin shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the shingles. Thomas stepped onto the rough wooden planks and looked around. There, nestled in a pile of loose hay near the far corner, was a bundle wrapped in what looked like a man's coat. The crying was coming from inside. Thomas crossed the loft in 3 long strides and knelt beside the bundle. His hands shook as he pulled back the coat. Inside was an infant, no more than a few weeks old, with a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face. The baby was wrapped in a thin blanket, far too thin for the cold, and was wailing with the desperate fury of the very young and very hungry. For a moment, Thomas could only stare. His mind couldn't make sense of it. A baby, here in his barn. He reached down, his rough hands clumsy and uncertain, and lifted the child from the hay. The baby was lighter than he expected, warm and solid and undeniably real. The crying didn't stop, but it changed pitch, as if the infant sensed it was no longer alone. Thomas held the child awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. It had been years since he'd held a baby. He and Margaret had wanted children, had talked about it on long winter nights, had imagined a house filled with the sound of little feet running across wooden floors. But it hadn't happened. And now here he was, holding someone else's child, with no idea where it had come from, or what he was supposed to do with it. That's when he noticed the note. It was pinned to the blanket with a simple safety pin, a piece of paper folded once and beginning to yellow at the edges. Thomas shifted the baby to one arm, fumbling with the pin, until it came free. He unfolded the note, his eyes scanning the words written in a shaky, hurried hand. Thomas, she's yours. Her name is Claire. I can't keep her. I'm sorry. Please take care of her. She deserves better than what I can give. Margaret would have wanted this. I know she would have. Forgive me. Sylvia? Thomas read the note once, then again, his mind struggling to process what it said. Sylvia. Margaret's younger sister. The one who'd disappeared 2 years ago. The one who'd vanished without a word or explanation, leaving nothing but questions and worry behind. Margaret had grieved for her, had spent her last months wondering where Sylvia had gone and whether she was safe. And now she'd left a baby in his barn with a note claiming the child was his. His. The word echoed in his head like a gunshot. How could the baby be his? He hadn't seen Sylvia in years, not since Margaret's funeral. She'd stood at the graveside, hollow-eyed and silent, and then she'd left before the service ended. He'd tried to find her afterward, to make sure she was all right, but she'd vanished like smoke. No forwarding address, no phone number, nothing. Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms. The crying had quieted to soft, hiccuping whimpers. The infant's eyes were closed, the tiny face still red and pinched, but peaceful now. Claire. The note said her name was Claire. He thought of Margaret then, thought of the way she'd always wanted a child, the way she'd smiled when they talked about names and nurseries and all the little dreams that had died with her. Margaret would have wanted this, the note said. Would she? Would his wife have wanted him to take in a baby under these circumstances, with so many questions unanswered? But even as the doubts crowded his mind, Thomas felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in 3 long years. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. A crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. This baby, whoever she was, wherever she'd come from, needed him. And Thomas Brennan, who'd spent 3 years walking through life like a ghost, suddenly found himself needed again. He climbed down from the loft carefully, cradling Claire against his chest. The baby had fallen asleep, her tiny fist curled against his shirt, her breathing soft and even. Thomas stood in the middle of the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and horses, and felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a blanket. He didn't know what to do next, didn't know if the note was telling the truth, didn't know where Sylvia was or why she'd left her child this way. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he couldn't leave this baby alone. Not now, not ever. Thomas walked back to the house, moving slowly, carefully, as if the infant in his arms might shatter at any sudden movement. Inside, the house felt different somehow. Less empty, less cold. He laid Claire down gently on the old sofa in the living room, surrounding her with cushions so she wouldn't roll. She didn't wake, just slept on, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He stood there for a long time, watching her. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and making the old house creak. But inside, in this moment, everything was still. Thomas thought about the note again, about Sylvia's words, about the impossibility of what she'd claimed. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd built together and the life they'd never gotten to live. And he thought about this tiny, helpless creature sleeping on his sofa, this child who'd been left in his care with nothing but a stranger's coat and a handful of desperate words. He didn't have answers, didn't have a plan. But as he stood there in the quiet of his living room watching the baby sleep, Thomas Brennan felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a reason to keep going, a reason that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or the endless, grinding work that had filled his days since Margaret died. He had a reason that was small and fragile and sleeping on his sofa. And that, for now, was enough. The baby woke an hour later with a cry that could crack stone. Thomas had been sitting in the kitchen, staring at the note for what must have been the 100th time, when the wailing started. He bolted from his chair and rushed into the living room, his heart hammering. Claire's face had gone from pink to deep red, her tiny fists pumping the air, like she was fighting off invisible demons. The sound she made was primal, desperate, and it cut straight through him. He stood there frozen for a moment, utterly helpless. What did babies need when they cried like that? Food, probably, or a clean diaper. Or both. Thomas had no idea which, and even less idea how to provide either. He'd been around newborn calves and foals his whole life, had pulled them into the world with his own hands, but a human infant. That was different territory entirely. He picked Claire up carefully, holding her at arm's length like she might explode. The crying intensified. Her whole body seemed to vibrate with it, and Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. He pulled her closer, tucking her against his shoulder, the way he'd seen women do in town, and started pacing the room. Back and forth, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. The crying didn't stop, but it changed pitch slightly, as if she was considering whether this strange man holding her was worth trusting. After 10 minutes of pacing, Thomas accepted the hard truth. He needed help. He bundled Claire back into the coat she'd arrived in, grabbed his truck keys and headed for the door. The nearest town was Clearwater, 15 miles down a winding mountain road. It was barely past 8 in the morning, but the general store would be open. Mrs. Iris Calloway ran that store, and if anyone in 3 counties knew about babies, it was Iris. The drive was nerve-wracking. Thomas had fashioned a makeshift bed in a wooden crate he'd found in the barn, stuffed with blankets and wedged onto the passenger seat. Claire screamed the entire way, her face contorted with rage or hunger or both. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, his jaw clenched, trying to focus on the road and not the desperate sounds coming from beside him. Clearwater wasn't much of a town. On Main Street lined with false front buildings, a church with a white steeple, a post office, a diner and Callaway's general store sitting right in the middle of it all. Thomas pulled up front and killed the engine. He sat there for a moment, listening to Claire's cries, and realized he had no idea how to explain this. How did a man walk into town with a baby that wasn't his, claim she'd been left in his barn, and not sound completely insane? He grabbed the crate and climbed out of the truck. The morning air was cold, crisp enough to sting his lungs. A few people on the street turned to look, their faces registering surprise and then curiosity. Thomas Brennan hadn't been to town in months, and now here he was, carrying a screaming infant in a wooden box. The gossip mill would be churning by noon. The bell above the door jangled as he pushed inside. The store smelled the way it always had, like coffee and sawdust, and the faint sweetness of penny candy. Iris Calloway stood behind the counter, a sturdy woman in her late 50s with steel-grey hair pulled back in a bun and eyes sharp enough to spot a lie at 50 paces. She looked up from her ledger, her expression shifting from mild interest to open shock. Thomas set the crate on the counter. Claire's crying had reached a fever pitch, her tiny face streaked with tears. Iris came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She peered into the crate, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. Then she looked at Thomas, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Thomas Brennan, whose baby is this?" Thomas pulled the note from his pocket and handed it over without a word. Iris unfolded it, read it quickly, and her expression softened just a fraction. She looked from the note to Thomas, to the screaming infant and back again. "Lord have mercy," she said quietly. Then more firmly, "This child needs feeding. When's the last time she ate?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I found her about 2 hours ago." Iris didn't waste time with more questions. She reached into the crate, scooped Claire up with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised 5 children of her own, and held her against her shoulder. The crying didn't stop, but Iris didn't seem bothered by it. She swayed gently, patting the baby's back, and turned to Thomas with the kind of look that brooked no argument. "You're going to need formula, bottles, diapers, and a proper place for her to sleep. That crate won't go past today." She paused, studying him. "You planning on keeping her?" Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "I don't know what I'm planning, but I can't leave her." Iris nodded, as if that was enough to answer enough. "All right then. We'll get you sorted." For the next hour, Iris transformed into a whirlwind of efficiency. She kept Claire tucked against her shoulder with one arm, while using the other to pull items from the shelves. Cans of carnation evaporated milk, glass bottles with rubber nipples, stacks of cloth diapers, a tin of baby powder. She even found a wicker bassinet gathering dust in the back room, left over from when the store had carried more baby goods. While Iris worked, she mixed formula according to some recipe she seemed to know by heart, heating water on the store's potbelly stove and measuring with the precision of a chemist. She tested the temperature on her wrist, nodded in satisfaction, and finally offered the bottle to Claire. The crying stopped instantly. The baby latched onto the nipple and drank with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been waiting her whole short life for this moment. Thomas watched all of this from the side, feeling useless and awed in equal measure. Iris made it look simple, natural, like holding a screaming infant and mixing formula while running a store was just another Tuesday morning. When Claire had drained half the bottle and her eyes started drooping, Iris looked at Thomas with something that might have been sympathy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You ever taken care of a baby before? No, Ma'am. Well, you're about to learn. She shifted Claire to show Thomas how to hold her properly, how to support the head, how to position the bottle so she wouldn't take in too much air. Babies are tougher than they look, but they need consistency. Feed her every 3 to 4 hours. Change her when she's wet. Keep her warm. That's the basics, Thomas nodded, trying to absorb it all. Iris continued, her voice gentler now. And Thomas, about that note, about what it says. He stiffened. I don't know if it's true. I don't see how it could be. Iris handed Claire back to him carefully, making sure he had a good grip before letting go. Sylvia disappeared near on 2 years ago. If this baby's only a few weeks old, then the math doesn't line up with you being the father, does it? No, but the note says she's yours. Could mean something different than blood. Iris fixed him with that steady gaze. Could mean Sylvia wanted her raised by someone who'd care, someone who loved her sister, someone who'd do right by a child that needed a home. Thomas looked down at Claire. She'd fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny fingers curled loosely, her breathing soft and even. The weight of her was barely anything at all, but it felt significant somehow, like holding something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. I'll need to find Sylvia, he said quietly. Get answers, you will. But first, you need to get that baby home and settled. Iris started packing supplies into a cardboard box. And Thomas, you're going to need more help than what I can give you in a store. There's a woman who just moved to town a few months back, staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street. Nora Whitfield. She's a nurse, worked in the hospital in Helena before coming here. Good woman. She might be willing to stop by your place, show you the ropes. Thomas nodded slowly. The idea of inviting a stranger to his ranch sat wrong with him, but he couldn't argue with the logic. He'd need help, real help, and pride had no place when there was a helpless infant depending on him. He paid for the supplies, loading everything into the truck, while Iris stood in the doorway, holding Claire. When everything was secured, she handed the baby back with a final piece of advice. One more thing. Babies can tell when you're scared or uncertain. They feel it. So even when you don't know what you're doing, act like you do. Be steady. That's what they need most. The drive back to the ranch was quieter. Claire slept the whole way, her small body warm against the blankets in the crate. Thomas kept glancing over at her, half expecting her to vanish like a dream. But she stayed solid and real, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Back at the ranch, Thomas carried everything inside and stood in the middle of his living room, suddenly aware of how inadequate his home was for a baby. The house was cold, dusty, filled with the kind of clutter that accumulated when a man lived alone and saw no point in tidying. He looked at the bassinet Iris had given him, then at the empty room that had once been intended as a nursery. Margaret had painted it yellow one spring, talking about the children they'd have someday. Thomas hadn't opened that door in 3 years. He opened it now. The room was exactly as Margaret had left it. Yellow walls, now faded. A rocking chair in the corner. An empty bookshelf. Dust covered everything, thick enough to show where his fingers trailed across the windowsill. But beneath the dust and the years of neglect, it was still a room meant for a child. Still a room full of hope that had never been fulfilled. Thomas set the bassinet down by the window where morning light would reach it. He cleaned the room quickly, sweeping and wiping until the yellow walls seemed brighter, until the air smelled less of abandonment and more of possibility. Then he brought Claire inside, laying her gently in the bassinet. She stirred but didn't wake, just made a small sound and settled deeper into sleep. He stood there watching her, this tiny stranger who'd appeared in his barn like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to speak. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, warming the room, and for the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt something other than the cold weight of grief pressing against his chest. The next few days passed in a blur of feeding schedules and diaper, changes and long nights where sleep came in scattered fragments. Thomas stumbled through it all with the grace of a man learning to walk on ice. He spilled formula on his shirt, fumbled with diaper pins, and once put Claire's nightgown on backward before realizing his mistake. But he learned. Slowly, clumsily, he learned. On the 3rd day, Nora Whitfield came to the ranch. She arrived in a battered Ford, dust trailing behind her as she drove up the long road to his house. Thomas watched from the porch as she climbed out. a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pinned back practically and a medical bag in one hand. She was tall, solid-looking, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on nonsense. "Mr. Brennan? I'm Nora Whitfield. Iris Calloway sent word you might need some assistance." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how he must look. He hadn't shaved in days. His clothes were rumpled and stained with formula, and he probably smelled like exhaustion and desperation. But if Nora noticed, she didn't comment. She simply followed him inside, set her bag down, and asked to see the baby. Claire was awake, lying in the bassinet and staring at the ceiling with that unfocused gaze newborns have. Nora approached slowly, her movements calm and measured. She picked Claire up, examined her with gentle, efficient hands, checking her over the way a doctor would. After a few minutes, she looked at Thomas and smiled. "She's healthy. Underweight, but that's to be expected given the circumstances. You've been feeding her regularly. Every 3 hours. Sometimes more if she fusses." "Good, that's good." Nora set Claire back in the bassinet and turned to Thomas. "Iris told me about the note. About how you found her." Thomas tensed. "You think I'm crazy?" "I think you're a man trying to do the right thing in a situation that makes no sense." She paused. "I also think you could use some help. I've got mornings free before my shift at the clinic starts. I can come by, show you what you need to know. Make sure the baby stays healthy." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe, or just gratitude that someone believed him, believed in him. "I'd appreciate that, Miss Whitfield." "It's Nora, and you're welcome." Over the following week, Nora became a steady presence at the ranch. She showed up each morning just after dawn, carrying bread from the diner or a thermos of coffee, and spent an hour teaching Thomas the small, crucial details of infant care. How to bathe a baby without drowning her or freezing her. How to recognize different kinds of cries and what they meant. How to burp her properly so she didn't spit up all over his shirt. But more than the practical lessons, Nora brought something else to the ranch. She brought conversation. She'd sit at Thomas's kitchen table while Claire napped, drinking coffee and talking about small things. The weather, the town, her work at the clinic. Thomas found himself talking back, sharing more than he'd shared with anyone in years. About the ranch, about Margaret, though those words came harder. About the strange, terrifying, overwhelming experience of suddenly being responsible for a tiny human life. "You're doing better than you think," Nora said one morning, watching as Thomas fed Claire with growing confidence. "Most new parents are terrified. At least you're honest about it." Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms. Claire's eyes were open, dark blue and serious, fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so small. Her tiny hand had found his thumb and gripped it with surprising strength. Something in his chest shifted, some piece of the wall he'd built around his heart cracking just a little wider. "I keep thinking about the note," he admitted, "about what Sylvia meant, whether Claire really is mine, or whether that was just something she wrote to make sure I'd keep her." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter?" "Doesn't it? Maybe, but here's what I see. A man who found a baby and didn't turn away. A man who's learning to be what she needs, even though he's scared. Blood doesn't always make a family, Thomas. Sometimes it's built from something stronger." Thomas didn't answer, but he held Claire a little closer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of approaching snow. Winter was coming, and with it all the hard months ahead. But inside, in this warm kitchen with a baby in his arms, and a woman who'd shown him unexpected kindness, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like maybe he wasn't quite so alone anymore. By the end of the second week, caring for Claire had become less terrifying and more routine. Thomas still fumbled sometimes, still had moments of panic when she cried, and he couldn't figure out why. But those moments grew fewer. He learned her rhythms, her needs, the small sounds she made that meant she was content or hungry or just needed to be held. The ranch hands had noticed, of course. Cole and Danny Westfield showed up for work one morning and found Thomas on the porch with a baby on his shoulder, pacing and patting her back. They'd stopped dead in their tracks, their expressions identical masks of confusion. "Boss," Cole had said carefully, "you got something you want to tell us?" Thomas had explained it as simply as he could. Found in the barn. Note said she was his. Didn't know more than that. The brothers had exchanged glances, shrugged, and gone to work without another word. But the next day, Danny had shown up with a small wooden horse he'd carved, setting it shyly on the porch rail. "For the baby," he'd muttered. When she's old enough, those small gestures of acceptance meant more than Thomas could articulate. His world, which had shrunk to the size of grief and loneliness, was slowly expanding again. Claire was at the center of it, this small, helpless thing that demanded everything from him and gave nothing back except the simple fact of her existence. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. Late one evening, after Claire had fallen asleep and the house had gone quiet, Thomas sat in the rocking chair in the nursery. The room no longer felt like a shrine to lost dreams. It felt lived in now, warmed by lamplight and the soft sounds of infant breathing. He held Sylvia's note in his hands, reading it again by the dim glow. "She's yours." Thomas looked at Claire sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. Maybe Sylvia had been lying. Maybe the baby wasn't his by blood, wasn't even related to him at all. But she was his now in the way that mattered most. She was his to protect, his to raise, his to love, if he could remember how. And sitting there in the quiet darkness, Thomas Brennan made a decision. He would find Sylvia. He would get his answers. But whatever those answers turned out to be, Claire would stay with him. She would have a home here, on this ranch beneath the mountains, with a man who'd forgotten how to live until she'd reminded him. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. The first snow melted within a week, leaving the ground soft and muddy. Thomas stood at the fence line watching his horses graze in the south pasture, Claire bundled against his chest in a sling Nora had fashioned from an old wool blanket. The baby slept through the cold morning air, her warm weight pressed against him, her breath creating tiny clouds of vapor that disappeared into the November sky. He'd grown accustomed to carrying her this way while working, one hand free for tools or gates, the other instinctively protective over her small body. 3 weeks had passed since he'd found her in the barn. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years in how completely they'd transformed his life. But despite the routine he'd built, despite the confidence he'd gained in caring for her, there remained one unavoidable truth. He had no legal right to keep this child. That reality crystallized the morning Sheriff Ben Hutchins drove up the long road to the ranch, his patrol car kicking up gravel and dust. Thomas had been expecting this visit. Small towns didn't keep secrets, and a widowed rancher suddenly appearing with an infant had been the subject of considerable speculation at the diner and the post office. He watched the sheriff climb out of his car, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "Thomas," Hutchins said by way of greeting. He nodded toward Claire. "That's the baby everyone's talking about?" "That's her. Mind if we talk inside?" They sat at the kitchen table, Claire asleep in her bassinet nearby. Thomas poured coffee and slid the cup across to Hutchins, then retrieved Sylvia's note from where he kept it folded in his shirt pocket. He'd read it so many times, the creases had begun to tear. He handed it over without comment. Hutchins read it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he set it down carefully on the table between them. "How long since you've seen Sylvia Hart?" "Margaret's funeral. 3 years back. She left before we could talk. Haven't heard from her since. And you found the baby when?" "October 15th, early morning. She was in my barn, wrapped in a coat, crying. The note was pinned to her blanket." Hutchins leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "You know I have to ask, is there any possibility the baby's yours? That you and Sylvia—" "No." Thomas's voice was flat, certain. "I haven't seen Sylvia in 3 years. This baby's maybe a month old. The math doesn't work. But the note says she's yours. The note says a lot of things I don't understand." Hutchins was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas across the table. Outside, one of the horses whinnied. A crow cawed from somewhere in the pines. Finally, the sheriff spoke again, his voice softer now. "Way I see it, we've got a situation here. Woman leaves a baby with a note claiming you're the father, but the timing makes that impossible. Woman's been missing for 2 years. No one knows where she is or why she left. And you've got an infant you're caring for, with no legal authority to do so." He paused. "Technically, I should be calling child services over in Helena, having them come collect the baby, put her in the system, until we can sort out who she belongs to." Thomas's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Something cold and sharp settled in his chest. "You planning on doing that?" Hutchins looked at Claire sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, then back at Thomas. "You doing right by her?" "Best I know how. She healthy? Fed? Warm?" Nora Whitfield comes by. "She's a nurse. Checks on Claire regular. Says she's thriving." Hutchins nodded slowly. "Here's what I think. I think that baby was left with you for a reason. Maybe Sylvia's the mother, maybe she isn't. Maybe there's a father out there somewhere who should be notified. Maybe there isn't, but what I know for certain is that right now, that baby's got a roof over her head and a man looking after her who clearly gives a damn. That's more than a lot of children have." Thomas waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I'm going to file a report," Hutchins continued. "Document the circumstances, the note, everything. And I'm going to look for Sylvia. Put the word out, see if anyone's seen her. But until we know more, I don't see any reason to uproot that baby from the only stable home she's got." He fixed Thomas with a steady gaze. "That said, you need to make this official. Talk to Judge Marlowe. Start the process for legal guardianship. Get yourself on solid ground before someone with less sense than me decides to make this their business." Relief flooded through Thomas. So suddenly he felt lightheaded. "I'll do that. Today if I can." "Good." Hutchins stood, draining the last of his coffee. At the door, he paused and looked back. "For what it's worth, Thomas, I think you're doing a fine thing here. That baby's lucky to have you." After the sheriff left, Thomas sat alone at the table, Claire's soft breathing the only sound in the quiet house. He thought about what Hutchins had said. Legal guardianship. Making it official. The idea both terrified and steadied him. It meant commitment. It meant standing before a judge and declaring his intention to raise this child, to be responsible for her future, her safety, her life. It meant no more pretending this was temporary, no more telling himself he was just helping until someone else came along to claim her. It meant choosing to be her father. The thought should have sent him running. 3 weeks ago it would have. But now, looking at Claire sleeping peacefully in the morning light, Thomas found he wasn't afraid. He was ready. Judge Eloise Marlowe held court in a small brick building on Clearwater's main street, serving 3 counties from an office that smelled of old books and wood polish. Thomas had put on his cleanest shirt, combed his hair back with water, and driven to town with Claire bundled in the passenger seat. Nora had offered to come along for moral support, and he'd accepted gratefully. Having her steady presence beside him made the whole thing feel less daunting. The judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and spectacles perched on her nose. She listened without interruption as Thomas explained the situation, Sylvia's note spread on the desk before her. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and regarded him thoughtfully. "Mr. Brennan, do you understand what you're asking for? Guardianship isn't something undertaken lightly. You'd be legally responsible for this child's welfare, her education, her health, everything. You'd be making decisions on her behalf until she comes of age. I understand, ma'am. You're a single man running a ranch. That's demanding work. How do you intend to care for an infant while managing your property?" Thomas had thought about this question, knew it would come. "I've hired help. Got 2 good men working the ranch full-time. And I've made arrangements with Miss Whitfield here to assist with Claire's care when needed. I'm not doing this alone." Judge Marlowe turned her attention to Nora. "And you're willing to support Mr. Brennan in this endeavor, Miss Whitfield?" "I am, Your Honor. I've been monitoring the baby's health since she arrived. She's well cared for, healthy, and clearly bonded with Mr. Brennan. He's demonstrated commitment and capability despite difficult circumstances." The judge made a note on the paper before her, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet office. "There's still the matter of the mother. This Sylvia Hart. We have no way of knowing if she intended to permanently relinquish the child or if she plans to return. The note says to take care of her," Thomas said quietly. "It says she deserves better than what Sylvia could give. That sounds permanent to me." "Perhaps. But without finding Miss Hart, we can't know for certain." Judge Marlowe removed her spectacles and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "However, given the circumstances and Sheriff Hutchins' recommendation, I'm prepared to grant temporary guardianship. 6 months initially. During that time, we'll continue efforts to locate Miss Hart. If she cannot be found and no other claimants come forward, we'll revisit the question of permanent guardianship. Does that seem reasonable?" Thomas felt something tight in his chest finally release. "Yes, ma'am. That's more than reasonable." "Very well." The judge pulled a form from her drawer and began filling it out. "The child's name is Claire, correct? No surname?" Thomas hesitated. He hadn't thought about this, about what name Claire would carry. But looking down at her now, sleeping peacefully in his arms, the answer seemed obvious. "Claire Brennan." Judge Marlowe glanced up, one eyebrow raised. "You're certain?" "Yes, ma'am. She's mine to care for. Seems right she should have my name." The judge nodded and continued writing. When she finished, she signed the document with a flourish and stamped it with an official seal. She slid it across the desk to Thomas. "Congratulations, Mr. Brennan. You're now the legal guardian of Claire Brennan. Don't make me regret this decision." Thomas took the paper with hands that trembled slightly. "Legal guardian, Claire Brennan. His daughter in every way that mattered now. I won't, Your Honor, I promise you that." Outside the courthouse, the winter sun shone bright and cold. Thomas stood on the steps, Nora beside him, Claire warm against his chest. He looked down at the document in his hands, at his name and Claire's written there in official ink, and felt something shift deep inside him. This was real now, permanent, or at least as permanent as anything in life could be. "How do you feel?" Nora asked softly. Thomas thought about it for a moment, searching for words to match the strange mix of emotions coursing through him. Finally he smiled, small but genuine. "Terrified but good. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Nora reached out and adjusted Claire's blanket, her touch gentle. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Thomas." The word hung in the air between them. Father. 3 weeks ago he'd been a widower living alone with his grief and his horses. Now he was a father. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, like waking up to find the world had changed overnight, but realizing you'd been moving toward this moment all along. Word of the guardianship spread through Clearwater faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the following Sunday, when Thomas drove into town for supplies, he found the community had responded. In ways he hadn't anticipated, Mrs. Calloway had organized what she called a baby shower, though Thomas quickly learned that was just polite language for the entire town, descending on his ranch with gifts and food and opinions. They came in trucks and wagons, families he'd known his whole life, and some he'd only nodded to in passing. They brought hand-knitted blankets and jars of preserved vegetables, used cribs and high chairs saved from their own children's youth. The women clustered around Claire, cooing and offering advice, while the men stood awkwardly on the porch, nursing beers and talking about everything except feelings. Martha Yates, who ran the diner, pressed a tin of cookies into his hands and said, "For when you need something sweet at 3 in the morning, trust me, you will." Old Frank Morrison, who owned the feed store, had brought a stack of well-worn picture books. "Read to her every night," he'd said gruffly. "Doesn't matter if she understands. It's the sound of your voice she needs." Even people Thomas barely knew showed up. The Kowalski family from 2 valleys over brought a wooden cradle hand-carved by the grandfather. Sarah Chen from the post office contributed tiny dresses her own daughter had outgrown. The Reverend Hayes from the Lutheran Church blessed Claire with a prayer and promised Sunday dinners whenever Thomas needed a break. Thomas stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and humbled. He'd spent 3 years pushing people away, building walls around his grief, convinced he was better off alone. But here they were anyway, these neighbors and near strangers, showing up because that's what community did. They took care of their own. And somewhere along the way, without him noticing, they decided Claire was one of them. Nora found him on the porch later, watching the sun sink toward the mountains while the party continued inside. She handed him a beer and leaned against the railing beside him. Quite a turnout. Thomas shook his head, still trying to process it all. I didn't expect this. Any of it. People are good, Thomas. When you give them a chance to be. He took a long drink, letting the cold, bitter taste ground him. I forgot that. After Margaret died, I forgot a lot of things. And now, he thought about the house full of laughter and conversation, about Claire being passed from person to person like precious cargo, about all these people who'd shown up simply because a baby needed a community around her. Now I'm remembering. The weeks that followed settled into something that almost felt like normal. Thomas had never imagined normal could include a baby, but there it was. Claire grew stronger, more alert, her unfocused gaze sharpening into something that looked almost like recognition when Thomas entered the room. She started sleeping longer at night, which meant Thomas slept longer too, though he still found himself waking at odd hours just to check that she was breathing. The ranch work continued around the rhythm of Claire's needs. Thomas learned to plan his days in 3-hour increments between feedings. He'd ride out to check fences with Claire strapped to his chest, her small warm weight becoming as familiar as his own heartbeat. The horses grew accustomed to her presence, their ears flicking toward her soft sounds, but otherwise unbothered. Cole and Danny adapted too, taking on more of the heavy work without being asked. Thomas would come back from a morning ride to find they'd already mucked the stalls, or repaired a section of fence, or moved hay bales he'd meant to get to later. When he tried to thank them, Cole just shrugged and said, "You got your hands full, boss." "We got this." Nora continued her morning visits, though they'd transformed from lessons into something closer to friendship. She'd arrive with fresh bread or a thermos of soup, and they'd sit at the kitchen table while Claire played on a blanket spread across the floor. They talked about everything and nothing. Nora told him about growing up in Helena, about nursing school and the patients she'd treated, about the quiet loneliness of being unmarried at 32 in a town that measured women's worth by their husbands and children. Thomas found himself sharing things he'd kept locked away for years, memories of Margaret that didn't hurt quite so much anymore, dreams he'd given up on, fears about whether he was doing right by Claire, whether he'd be enough. "You're enough," Nora assured him one morning. "You're more than enough. Look at her, Thomas." She's happy. It was true. Claire smiled now, great toothless grins that transformed her whole face. She laughed at silly sounds and reached for things with increasing coordination. When Thomas sang to her old ranch songs he'd learned as a boy, she'd go still and quiet, her eyes fixed on his face like he was performing miracles. One evening in early December, Thomas sat in the rocking chair in Claire's room, watching her sleep. The snow had returned, falling thick and steady outside the window, blanketing the world in silence. A fire crackled in the small stove he'd installed to keep the room warm. Everything felt peaceful, settled, right. He thought about Sylvia's note, which he'd placed in an envelope and stored in his desk drawer. He still didn't have answers about why she'd left Claire here, about whether the baby was really connected to him by blood or if the note had been a desperate lie to ensure he'd keep her. Sheriff Hutchins had put out inquiries but found nothing. Sylvia Hart had vanished completely, leaving no trail to follow. Part of Thomas still wanted those answers, wanted to understand what had happened, why she'd made the choices she had. But increasingly the questions felt less urgent. Claire was here, she was his. The how and why mattered less with each passing day. He heard footsteps on the porch, then a soft knock. Thomas rose carefully, leaving Claire asleep, and opened the door to find Nora standing there with snow in her hair and concern in her eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes. No, I don't know." She stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. I need to tell you something, and I've been putting it off because I didn't know how you'd take it. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. What is it? Nora took a breath. I've been asking around about Sylvia, discreetly, to people I know in Helena, people who might have crossed paths with her. She paused. I found someone who saw her about a year ago. She was working at a boarding house, pregnant and alone. The woman I talked to said Sylvia mentioned Montana, mentioned family here, but she left before the baby was born. No one knows where she went. Thomas absorbed this slowly. So Claire is Sylvia's daughter. It seems likely, yes, but she's not mine. Not by blood, Nora met his gaze steadily. Does that change anything? Thomas looked toward the nursery, toward the room where Claire slept, warm and safe and completely dependent on him. He thought about the last 2 months, about learning to be what she needed, about the way his chest tightened when she cried and loosened when she smiled, about how completely she'd become the center of his world. No, he said finally, it doesn't change a thing. Nora smiled, relief evident on her face. Good, because that baby loves you, Thomas. Anyone can see it, love. The word felt too big and too simple all at once. But standing there in his warm house, with snow falling outside and a baby sleeping in the next room, Thomas realized it was true. Somewhere between the terror and the sleepless nights and the 1,000 small decisions that made up each day, love had taken root. Not the romantic love he'd shared with Margaret, but something just as powerful. Something that felt like responsibility and joy and fierce protectiveness all wound together. He'd found Claire in his barn on a cold October morning, a stranger's child, with a stranger's note. And now, 2 months later, she was his daughter, his family. His reason for getting up each morning and his last thought before sleeping each night. Thomas Brennan had spent 3 years learning how to survive loss. Now finally, he was learning how to live again. Christmas came to the ranch on a clear, cold morning. Thomas woke before dawn to find fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming the world into something clean and new. He fed Claire, changed her, and dressed her in a red velvet dress that Mrs. Calloway had insisted she needed for her first Christmas. Claire fussed at the fancy clothes, but Thomas persevered. And by the time Nora arrived with a basket of gifts and a determination to make the day special, Claire looked like a perfect Christmas angel. They spent the day in the warmth of the living room. A small pine tree Thomas had cut from his own land, standing in the corner, decorated with strings of popcorn and paper stars. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Nora had brought gifts she'd wrapped in brown paper and tied with ribbon. For Claire, a soft stuffed rabbit. For Thomas, a leather-bound journal with a note tucked inside for recording memories. She'll want to know her story someday. Thomas held the journal in his hands, feeling the weight of that responsibility. Claire's story. It had started with mystery and abandonment, with questions that might never have answers. But it had become something else. It had become a story about second chances and unexpected grace, about a man who'd forgotten how to hope and a baby who'd reminded him. Late that afternoon, with Claire napping and Nora beside him on the sofa, Thomas opened the journal to the first page. In his careful, unpracticed handwriting, he wrote, "Claire came to me on October 15th, in the year 1947. She was left in my barn, tiny and crying, with nothing but a note that said she was mine. I didn't know if it was true then. I still don't know now. But this is what I've learned. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the choice you make to show up, to stay, to love even when it's hard. Claire is my daughter, not because biology says so, but because my heart does. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything." He closed the journal and looked out the window at the snow-covered land, at his ranch stretching out toward the mountains. Everything had changed, and everything was exactly as it should be. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Brennan was home. Spring arrived late that year, reluctant and cautious, as if winter had grown too comfortable and needed convincing to leave. By mid-March, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the valleys mud-slicked and brown. Thomas spent long days repairing winter damage, replacing rotted fence posts and clearing fallen timber from the access roads. Claire rode with him in a canvas carrier Nora had sewn, strapped to his back while he worked. At 6 months old, she'd grown pudgy and alert, her dark eyes taking in everything with serious interest. She'd started babbling, nonsense sounds that Thomas swore were almost words, and when he sang while working, she'd join in with her own tuneless contribution. Life had found a rhythm that felt permanent. Thomas no longer woke in the night seized by panic that he was doing everything wrong. The haunted quality that had shadowed him since Margaret's death had lifted, replaced by something steadier. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple satisfaction of being needed. Nora still came by most mornings, though her visits had evolved beyond checking on Claire's welfare. They'd become friends, real friends, the kind who could sit in comfortable silence or talk for hours about nothing important. Some folks in town had started speculating about whether there might be more between them, but Thomas didn't let himself think too hard about that. He had Claire, he had his ranch, and for now that was enough. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late March, everything changed. Thomas was in the barn, replacing leather straps on an old harness, when he heard tires crunching on the gravel drive. He looked up to see an unfamiliar car, a black Studebaker coated in road dust, pulling up to the house. A man climbed out, tall and lean with dark hair slicked back, and a suit that looked expensive even from a distance. He stood for a moment surveying the property, his hands in his pockets, before walking toward the barn with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. Thomas set down his tools and stepped into the doorway, wiping his hands on his jeans. Something about the stranger's bearing set him on edge, though he couldn't say why. The man stopped a few feet away and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Thomas Brennan." "I am." "Can I help you?" "My name is Vincent Ashford. I'm here about a child. A baby girl who was left at this ranch last October." He paused, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I believe you're calling her Claire." Thomas felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "What business is that of yours?" "She's my daughter, Mr. Brennan. I'm here to take her home." The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Thomas's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. This man, this stranger, claiming Claire. Claiming rights Thomas had only just begun to believe were his. "You've got proof of that?" Thomas kept his voice level, though his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He held it out, and Thomas took it with reluctant hands. It was a birth certificate from a hospital in Spokane, Washington. The mother's name was listed as Sylvia May Hart. The father's name, Vincent James Ashford. The baby's name, Claire Elizabeth Ashford. Date of birth, October 7th, 1947. Thomas stared at the paper, the words swimming before his eyes. A birth certificate, official, stamped, legitimate. Everything he didn't have. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "If you're the father, why was Claire left here? Why not with you?" Vincent's expression darkened. "Sylvia and I had complications. Personal matters I won't discuss with a stranger. The point is, she took my daughter and disappeared. I've been searching for months. When I finally tracked Sylvia down in Helena, she told me what she'd done. That she'd left Claire here with you." He paused. "I appreciate you caring for her, Mr. Brennan, truly, but she belongs with her real father now. Real father." The words struck like a blow. Thomas looked past Vincent toward the house, where Claire was napping in her bassinet, completely unaware that her world was about to be torn apart. Again. "Claire's been with me for 5 months. She's settled here, happy. You can't just show up and take her." "Actually, I can." Vincent's voice hardened. "I have legal documentation of paternity." "You have temporary guardianship granted under false pretenses, since the mother's whereabouts were supposedly unknown." "Well, now they're known." "Now I'm known. Your guardianship is void, Mr. Brennan." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. "You're going to walk in here and rip a 6-month-old baby away from the only home she's known. From the person who's cared for her since she was weeks old. I'm going to reclaim my daughter, yes. What kind of man would I be if I didn't?" Vincent stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that might have been sympathetic if it wasn't so cold. Look, I understand you've grown attached, but you knew this was temporary. You knew someone might come forward. That someone is me, and I have every legal right to my child. Where were you when she was crying in my barn? Where were you when she needed feeding every 3 hours, when she was sick, when she needed someone to hold her? Thomas's voice had risen, despite his best efforts to stay calm. You don't know her. You don't know what she likes, what frightens her, how she falls asleep. You're a stranger to her, a stranger with legal rights that supersede your temporary arrangement. Vincent pulled a card from his pocket and held it out. I've retained a lawyer in Helena, Garson Hayes. You can have your attorney contact him to discuss the transition. I'm staying at the boarding house in town for the next few days while we sort through the details. But make no mistake, Mr. Brennan, I'm leaving Montana with my daughter. He turned and walked back to his car without waiting for a response. Thomas stood frozen in the barn doorway, the birth certificate crumpling in his tight grip, watching the black Studebaker disappear down the drive in a cloud of dust. The rage drained out of him all at once, replaced by something worse, fear, the kind of fear that comes when you realize everything you love can be taken away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Thomas walked to the house on legs that felt disconnected from his body. Inside, Claire was awake, making soft cooing sounds and waving her fists at the mobile Nora had hung above her bassinet. When she saw Thomas, her face broke into a huge smile, the kind that showed her 2 new bottom teeth. She reached for him, and he picked her up automatically, holding her against his chest. It's all right, he whispered, though he didn't know if he was talking to her or himself. We'll figure this out, I promise, but the promise felt hollow. What could he do against a birth certificate, against legal paternity, against a man who had every right to claim his own child? He called Nora first, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. She arrived within the hour, her face pale but determined. While she held Claire, Thomas called Judge Marlowe's office, then Sheriff Hutchins, trying to understand what his options were. The answer, from both, was the same. If Vincent Ashford could prove paternity and had committed no crimes that would disqualify him from custody, there was little Thomas could do to prevent him from taking Claire, even though I have guardianship? Thomas asked the judge when she called him back that evening. Temporary guardianship, Mr. Brennan, granted specifically because the parents were unknown and the child needed immediate care. If a biological parent appears with a legitimate claim, that changes everything. Judge Marlowe's voice was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry. I know you've bonded with the child, but the law is clear on this, so that's it. He just takes her? Not immediately. There will need to be a hearing to verify his claim, ensure he's fit to parent, establish that he can provide adequate care. But if everything checks out, yes. Biological parents have primacy under the law. Thomas hung up and sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. Nora sat across from him, Claire asleep in her arms. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Maybe he's lying, Nora said finally. Maybe the birth certificate is forged. Maybe he's not really the father. He knew details. Knew about Sylvia, knew when Claire was born, knew she'd been left here. Thomas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. It fits together too well to be a lie. Then we fight it anyway. We find a lawyer. We make them prove everything. We make sure this man is who he says he is, and that he can actually care for her properly. Nora's voice was fierce. You don't give up on her, Thomas. Not after everything. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to think there was a way through this that didn't end with Claire being taken away. But looking at her sleeping peacefully in Nora's arms, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. Vincent Ashford had legal rights. Thomas had only love, and the law didn't care about that. The next morning, Thomas drove to Helena to meet with a lawyer Nora had recommended. Malcolm Pierce was an older man with kind eyes and a reputation for fighting lost causes. He listened to Thomas's story, examined Vincent's birth certificate, and then delivered the verdict Thomas had been dreading. He's got a strong case, I won't lie to you. Birth certificate looks legitimate. Mother's name matches. Timeline fits. If he can demonstrate financial stability and pass a background check, a judge will almost certainly grant him custody. Pierce leaned back in his chair. But there are things we can argue. The abandonment issue, for instance. Why did Sylvia leave the child with you instead of with him? What was happening in their relationship that made her feel that was necessary? If we can demonstrate he was abusive or neglectful, that he posed a danger to either Sylvia or the child, we might have grounds to contest his custody. You're saying we need to prove he's unfit? Essentially, yes. Otherwise, biology trumps everything else. Thomas left the lawyer's office feeling both hope and dread. Hope that there might be a way to keep Claire. Dread at what fighting would mean, what digging into Vincent Ashford's past might uncover, and what Claire would go through caught in the middle of it all. He returned to the ranch to find Vincent's car parked in his drive again. This time the man wasn't alone. Sheriff Hutchins stood on the porch, his expression troubled, while Vincent waited by his vehicle. Thomas's heart began to pound. What's going on? Hutchins met him halfway across the yard, speaking low. He's got a court order, Thomas. Judge in Spokane granted him supervised visitation pending the custody hearing. I have to allow him to see the baby, like hell you do. Thomas moved toward the house, but Hutchins caught his arm. Thomas, don't. You fight this the wrong way. You'll lose any chance you have of keeping her. Let him visit. 1 hour supervised. That's all the order says. Every instinct Thomas had screamed at him to refuse, to bar the door and dare them to try to get past him. But Hutchins was right. Going against a court order would only hurt his case. Hand shaking, he nodded. Nora was inside with Claire, and Thomas could see the panic in her eyes when he explained what was happening. They set up in the living room, Thomas and Nora sitting on one side, while Vincent took the chair across from them. Hutchins stood by the door, a silent presence meant to keep everyone civil. Vincent's attention was entirely on Claire. The baby, now awake and alert, regarded him with the solemn wariness she showed all strangers. When he reached for her, she turned her face into Nora's shoulder and started to whimper. It's all right, Vincent said softly. I'm your father, Claire. I know you don't remember me, but I've missed you so much. The words made Thomas want to hit something. This man had never held Claire at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Had never changed a diaper or mixed formula or sung her to sleep. He was a stranger, claiming ownership of a child based on nothing but biology and legal documents. Nora reluctantly handed Claire over, and Vincent held her awkwardly, clearly unpracticed. Claire immediately began to cry, her face scrunching up in distress. She reached toward Thomas, her small hands grasping at air, and the sound of her crying was like a knife in his chest. She doesn't know you, Thomas said, his voice tight. You're frightening her. She'll adjust. Vincent stood, bouncing Claire slightly in an attempt to soothe her. It only made her cry harder. Children are resilient. She'll learn to love me. The hour felt like an eternity. Vincent held Claire while she cried, attempting conversation that neither Thomas nor Nora engaged with. He talked about his plans, about the house he owned in Spokane, about the nanny he'd already hired. He talked about Claire like she was a possession he'd temporarily misplaced and was now reclaiming. And all the while Claire cried, reaching for Thomas, clearly distressed and confused about why the man who'd always comforted her wouldn't take her now. When the hour finally ended, and Vincent returned Claire to Thomas's arms, she buried her face in his neck and sobbed. Thomas held her tight, murmuring reassurances, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. Vincent stood at the door, watching them. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite doubt, but something close to it. Then it was gone, replaced by cool determination. The hearing is set for April 12th, he said. I suggest you prepare yourself, Mr. Brennan. Claire is coming home with me, one way or another. After he left, Thomas sat in the rocking chair with Claire until her crying finally subsided into hiccuping breaths and then sleep. Nora sat on the floor beside them, her hand resting on his knee, neither of them speaking. There were no words adequate for what they were facing. Outside, the spring wind rattled the windows. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, dark and threatening. Thomas looked down at Claire's tear-stained face, at the way she'd curled her small fist into his shirt even in sleep, and felt something harden in his chest. Vincent Ashford might have legal rights. He might have documentation and lawyers and the law on his side. But Thomas had something more powerful than any of that. He had 5 months of sleepless nights and small victories and moments of joy so pure they ached. He had the weight of Claire's trust, the responsibility of her love, the knowledge of every sound she made and what it meant. He was her father in every way that mattered, and he'd be damned if he'd give her up without a fight. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Thomas hired Malcolm Pierce officially, and together they built their case. They documented every aspect of Claire's care, gathered testimonials from Nora, from Iris Calloway, from neighbors who'd witnessed Thomas's devotion. They worked to uncover information about Vincent Ashford, sending inquiries to Spokane, digging into his background. What they found was troubling, but not definitive. Vincent had been married twice before, both marriages ending in divorce. He'd been arrested once for assault, though the charges had been dropped. He owned a successful import business, but traveled frequently, which raised questions about his ability to provide consistent care for an infant. It was enough to create doubt, but would it be enough to deny him custody? Thomas didn't know, and the uncertainty ate at him. He went through the motions of ranch work, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly churning through scenarios and possibilities. What if he lost? What if Claire was taken to Spokane, to a stranger's house, to a life without him? The thought was unbearable. Worse were the supervised visits. Every 3 days, Vincent would arrive with Sheriff Hutchins, and Thomas would have to hand Claire over for an hour of awkward interaction that left her distressed and crying. Each visit felt like a small death, a preview of what permanent separation would be like. And each time Vincent left, Thomas would hold Claire and promise her things he wasn't sure he could deliver. "You're staying with me," he'd whisper. "I won't let him take you, I promise." But promises, he was learning, were fragile things. They could break under the weight of legal documents and biological claims, and a system that valued blood over everything else. 1 week before the hearing, Nora found Thomas sitting on the porch long after midnight, unable to sleep. She sat beside him without speaking, just her presence a comfort in the darkness. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "I keep thinking about the day I found her. How I almost didn't go into the barn. How if I'd been even an hour later, she might have frozen." He paused. "It feels like fate, you know. Like she was meant to be here. Like I was meant to find her." "I believe that," Nora said softly. "Then why does it feel like fate's taking her back?" Nora took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Because sometimes the right thing doesn't happen easy. Sometimes you have to fight for it. And sometimes, even when you do everything right, you still lose." She turned to look at him, her eyes fierce in the moonlight. "But you haven't lost yet, Thomas. And until you do, you keep fighting." He wanted to believe her, wanted to think that love and determination would be enough. But sitting there in the darkness, with the hearing looming and Claire sleeping inside, unaware of how her world might soon be shattered, Thomas Brennan allowed himself to feel something he'd been pushing away since Vincent Ashford's first appearance. He allowed himself to feel afraid. Malcolm Pierce called on a Wednesday morning, 5 days before the hearing, his voice carrying an urgency that made Thomas's chest tighten. The lawyer had been following a lead in Spokane, interviewing people who knew Vincent Ashford, trying to build a picture of the man beyond what legal documents showed. What he'd found changed everything. "I need you to come to Helena today," Pierce said without preamble. "I've got someone you need to meet. Someone who can tell us what really happened." Thomas made arrangements for Nora to watch Claire and drove the hour to Helena with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles ached. Pierce's office was in a converted house near the courthouse, and when Thomas arrived, the lawyer met him at the door with an expression that was equal parts grim and determined. Inside, sitting in the small waiting area, was a woman Thomas didn't recognize. She was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun and exhaustion written across her face. She wore a waitress uniform from a diner, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When she looked up at Thomas, her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. "Mr. Brennan, this is Grace Patterson," Pierce said. She worked with Sylvia Hart in Spokane, at a boarding house where Sylvia stayed before Claire was born. "She has information about Vincent Ashford." "Information I think you need to hear." Thomas sat down across from Grace, his heart pounding. "You knew Sylvia?" Grace nodded slowly. "I knew her for about 8 months. She came to Spokane in February of last year, 7 months pregnant and scared out of her mind. Mrs. Dalton, who ran the boarding house, took her in, let her work for room and board until the baby came. I worked there too, helping with the cooking and cleaning. Sylvia and I became friends." She paused, her fingers tightening around the coffee cup. "She told me everything. About Vincent. About why she ran." "Tell me," Thomas said quietly. Grace took a shaky breath. "Sylvia met Vincent in Helena about a year before she came to Spokane. She'd been working at a hotel, trying to make enough money to get back on her feet after your wife died. Margaret's death hit her hard. She felt guilty, like she should have been there more, should have helped somehow. She was lost." Grace looked down at her hands. "Vincent was charming at first, sophisticated. He traveled for business, always had money to spend. He swept her off her feet, made her feel special. By the time she realized what he really was, it was too late. She was pregnant. What do you mean, what he really was?" "He was violent, Mr. Brennan, not at first. At first he was perfect. But once she got pregnant, once she was dependent on him, everything changed. He'd get angry over nothing. He'd grab her, shake her, tell her she was worthless, that no one else would want her." Grace's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "One night he hit her so hard, she thought she'd lose the baby. That's when she knew she had to leave." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. "She told you this?" "She showed me the bruises. They were still healing when she got to Spokane. Yellow and green all down her ribs and back." Grace met his eyes. She was terrified of him, Mr. Brennan. Terrified he'd find her. Terrified of what he'd do to her, or the baby if he did. That's why she didn't go to a hospital when Claire was born. Mrs. Dalton helped deliver the baby in her room at the boarding house, just the two of them. Sylvia didn't want any records, didn't want anything that could lead Vincent to them. Then why did she leave Claire with me? Why not keep her and disappear?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Because she knew Vincent would never stop looking. He'd told her that. He'd said if she ever tried to leave him, he'd track her down, take the baby, and make sure she never saw her child again. He said he had money, had lawyers, had connections. He said no court would give custody to a woman with no family, no job, no stability. He said he'd prove she was unfit and she'd lose everything." Thomas's mind raced, pieces falling into place. "So she left Claire with me because she thought I could protect her. Because I had legal standing, a home, resources, and because you were family," Grace said softly. "She told me about Margaret, about how much your wife wanted children. She said if Margaret had lived, she would have wanted Claire raised by someone good, someone kind, someone who'd love her the way she deserved. Sylvia believed you were that person." Grace wiped at her eyes. "She said it broke her heart to leave Claire, but she knew it was the only way to keep her safe from Vincent. She thought if she disappeared completely, Vincent would eventually give up looking. She didn't know he'd find out where she'd left the baby." The room fell silent. Thomas sat back in his chair, processing everything he'd just heard. The note made sense now. The desperation in Sylvia's words, the claim that Claire was his, not biologically, but in every other way that mattered. Sylvia had given him her daughter because she trusted him to do what she couldn't, stand up to Vincent Ashford and win. Pierce leaned forward, his expression serious. "Grace has agreed to testify at the hearing, to tell the judge everything Sylvia told her about Vincent's abuse. It's hearsay, but combined with his arrest record and the pattern of behavior, it might be enough to raise questions about his fitness as a parent." "Might be," Thomas repeated, catching the uncertainty in the lawyer's tone. "It's not a guarantee," Pierce admitted. Vincent will claim she's lying, that Sylvia made up stories to justify abandoning her child. Without Sylvia here to corroborate Grace's testimony, it becomes a question of credibility. But it's more than we had before. Thomas looked at Grace. Why are you doing this? Coming forward, testifying. You barely knew Sylvia, because I have a daughter too, Grace said simply. She's 3 years old. Her father was like Vincent, all charm until he showed his real face. I got out, but it wasn't easy, and I was lucky. Not every woman is. She straightened her shoulders. Sylvia was trying to save her baby the only way she knew how. The least I can do is make sure her sacrifice wasn't for nothing. Thomas left Helena with a purpose hardening in his chest. Vincent Ashford wasn't just a biological father claiming his rights. He was a man who'd hurt Sylvia, who'd driven her to such desperation that she'd given up her own child to keep her safe. And now Thomas understood what he was really fighting for. Not just to keep Claire, but to protect her from a man who'd already proven himself dangerous. Back at the ranch, Thomas found Nora sitting on the porch with Claire on her lap, reading from one of the picture books Frank Morrison had given them. The sight of them together, peaceful in the afternoon sun, made his throat tight. This was Claire's world. This quiet ranch, these gentle people, this life built on safety and love. How could any court take that away and give her to Vincent Ashford? He told Nora everything Grace had revealed. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently stroking Claire's dark hair. "We have to find Sylvia," she said finally. "If Grace's testimony alone isn't enough, we need Sylvia's. She's the only one who can prove what Vincent really is. She's been hiding for over a year. How are we supposed to find her?" "Grace might know more than she told you. Places Sylvia mentioned, people she knew, somewhere she might have gone." Nora looked at him, her jaw set with determination. "We have 5 days, Thomas. 5 days to find her and convince her to come forward." It wasn't much time, but it was all they had. Thomas called Grace that evening. She was hesitant at first, worried about putting Sylvia in danger if they tracked her down. But when Thomas explained that without Sylvia's testimony, Claire would almost certainly go to Vincent, Grace reluctantly shared what little she knew. Sylvia had mentioned a cousin in Butte, a woman named Rebecca who'd helped her years ago when things got bad. It wasn't much, but it was a starting point. The next morning, Thomas and Nora left Claire with Iris Calloway and drove to Butte. The city sprawled across the hillside, a maze of mining operations and neighborhoods built around the extraction of copper from the earth. They found Rebecca Walsh living in a small house near the Granite Mountain mine, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who eyed them with suspicion when they knocked on her door. "I'm Thomas Brennan," he said. "I'm looking for Sylvia Hart. I have her daughter, Claire." Rebecca's expression shifted from suspicion to something like relief mixed with fear. "Is the baby all right?" "She's fine. She's been with me since October. But the man who fathered her, Vincent Ashford, he's trying to take her. I need Sylvia's help to stop him." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. There's something you need to understand." Inside, the house was cramped but clean, filled with the smell of coffee and bread. Rebecca poured them cups and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Sylvia's been here for 3 months. She's working at a laundry downtown, using a different name. She's terrified, Mr. Brennan. Terrified that Vincent will find her, that he'll hurt her or take Claire. When she left the baby with you, she thought that was the end of it. She thought she could disappear and Claire would be safe." "She is safe," Thomas said, "but only if Sylvia helps me keep her that way. Vincent has a birth certificate. He has legal standing. The only way I can fight him is if Sylvia testifies to what he did, why she left. If she testifies, he'll know where she is. He'll come after her. If she doesn't testify, he gets Claire. And what do you think he'll use her for? Leverage, control, a way to force Sylvia back into his life." Thomas leaned forward. "I've been raising Claire for 6 months. I love her like she's my own. But Sylvia's her mother, She deserves to be part of her daughter's life, to know she's safe and happy. That can't happen as long as Vincent Ashford has any claim to her. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, then sighed.
I'll talk to her.
But I can't promise she'll agree. She's fragile right now, Mr. Brennan. What he did to her, what she's been through, it broke something inside her. I understand. But tell her this. I'm not asking her to face him alone. I'm asking her to stand with me, to help me protect the daughter she loved enough to give up. That takes courage I can't even imagine. But if she can find just a little more, we might be able to keep Claire safe forever. Rebecca promised to talk to Sylvia that evening. Thomas and Nora checked into a small hotel near the city centre and waited. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas paced the small room, unable to sit still, his mind churning through possibilities. What if Sylvia refused? What if fear kept her silent? What if they'd come all this way for nothing? Just after 9, there was a knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find Rebecca standing in the hallway, and beside her, a woman who made his breath catch. She looked like Margaret. Not exactly, but the resemblance was there in the shape of her face, the way she held herself, the sadness in her eyes. This was Margaret's little sister, the girl who'd grown up too fast and lost too much. Sylvia, Thomas said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Is she all right, Claire? Is she really all right? She's perfect, healthy and happy and so loved. Thomas stepped back. Come in, please. Sylvia entered the room slowly, Rebecca beside her for support. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Thomas pulled a photo from his wallet, one Nora had taken just last week. Claire sitting in the grass, her face split with a toothless grin, reaching for dandelions. He handed it to Sylvia. She took it with shaking hands and stared at it for a long moment. Then she pressed it to her chest and started to cry, quiet sobs that shook her thin frame. Rebecca sat beside her, an arm around her shoulders, while Thomas and Nora waited. Finally, Sylvia looked up. I didn't know what else to do. He said he'd take her from me. He said I was worthless, that I'd be a terrible mother, that no court would choose me over him. He had money and status, and I had nothing. Her voice broke. I knew about you, Mr. Brennan. Margaret talked about you all the time when we were younger. She said you were the best man she'd ever known. She said if she ever had children, she hoped they'd grow up to be like you. Sylvia wiped at her eyes. When Claire was born, when I held her and knew I couldn't keep her safe, you were the only person I could think of. The only person I trusted. You made the right choice, Thomas said gently. Claire's had a good life these past months. She's surrounded by people who care about her. But Vincent's trying to take her, Sylvia. He has legal documentation. And without your testimony, without you telling the truth about what he did, a judge might give her to him. Fear flashed across Sylvia's face. If I testify, he'll find me. He'll hurt me. I won't let that happen. Thomas knelt down in front of her, so they were eye level. I promise you, if you help me keep Claire safe, I'll make sure you're protected too. You can come back to Montana, stay at the ranch if you want, or somewhere else, if that feels safer. But you won't face him alone. Can I see her? Sylvia's voice was barely a whisper. Before the hearing. Can I see Claire? Thomas glanced at Nora, who nodded. Of course. You're her mother, Sylvia. You have every right. They drove back to Montana the next day, Sylvia quiet in the back seat, staring out at the passing landscape like a woman seeing the world for the first time after a long darkness. At the ranch, Iris had just put Claire down for a nap. Thomas led Sylvia into the nursery, the room Margaret had painted yellow years ago, and watched as she approached the bassinet with trembling steps. Claire was sleeping on her back, her fists curled beside her head, her expression peaceful. Sylvia stood over her for a long time, tears streaming silently down her face. Then very gently she reached down and stroked the baby's cheek with one finger. She's beautiful, Sylvia whispered. She looks like Margaret. She has your eyes, Thomas said. And when she smiles, she lights up the whole room. Sylvia turned to look at him. Thank you for taking care of her, for loving her when I couldn't. You did love her. You gave her up to keep her safe. That's the hardest kind of love there is. Over the next 3 days, Sylvia stayed at the ranch. She was quiet, almost ghost-like, but slowly she began to relax. She'd sit with Claire, holding her carefully, singing soft lullabies in a voice that reminded Thomas painfully of Margaret. She helped Nora with meals and cleaning, keeping her hands busy as if stillness would let the fear catch up with her. And in the evenings, she'd tell Thomas more about what had happened with Vincent, the escalating violence, the isolation, the threats that had finally driven her to run. Malcolm Pierce came to the ranch to prepare Sylvia for her testimony. He was patient but thorough, asking questions that made her flinch but that needed to be answered. What had Vincent done? When? Were there witnesses? Medical records? Anything that could corroborate her story beyond just her word? Sylvia had little to offer. She'd hidden the abuse, ashamed and afraid. She'd seen a doctor once in Helena after Vincent had cracked one of her ribs, but she'd given a false name and paid in cash. There were no police reports, no documented incidents. Just her memories and the scars that had faded but never quite disappeared. It's not ideal, Pierce admitted after Sylvia had gone to bed. But combined with Grace's testimony and Vincent's history, it might be enough to at least delay custody. Give us time to dig deeper, find more evidence. And if it's not enough, Thomas asked, then we hope the judge sees through Vincent Ashford's performance. That he recognizes this isn't about what's legally right, but about what's best for the child. Pierce closed his briefcase. Get some rest, Thomas. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. The night before the hearing, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair in Claire's room, watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her face. The way her nose scrunched when she dreamed, the soft sound she made, the rise and fall of her tiny chest. This might be his last night with her. By this time tomorrow, a judge might have decided she belonged to Vincent Ashford, and all Thomas's love and care and promises would count for nothing against biological rights and legal documents. Sylvia found him there sometime after midnight. She stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. Can't sleep either. Thomas shook his head. Too much thinking. She came into the room and sat on the floor beside the rocking chair. I'm scared, terrified actually, of seeing him again, of what he'll say, of what the judge will decide. Me too. They sat in silence for a while. Two people bound together by love for the same child, both facing the possibility of losing her. Finally, Sylvia spoke again. Margaret would be proud of you, of what you've done for Claire, of the man you've been, she paused. I'm sorry I put this burden on you. Sorry I didn't have the courage to keep her myself. You had courage, Thomas said firmly. You had the courage to choose what was best for her over what you wanted. That's the hardest choice any parent can make. Sylvia reached up and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Tomorrow, whatever happens, I want you to know something. You're her father, not Vincent, you. Blood doesn't make a family, Mr. Brennan. Love does. And you've given Claire more love in 6 months than most children get in a lifetime. Thomas squeezed her hand, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They sat together in the darkness, keeping vigil over the child they both loved, waiting for morning and whatever verdict it would bring. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Thomas rose and dressed in his best suit. It was the same one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and putting it on felt like donning armor for battle. Sylvia wore a simple dress Nora had lent her, and together they prepared for the drive to Helena. Nora would stay behind with Claire, unable to bear watching the hearing, unable to risk seeing Vincent Ashford walk away with the baby she'd helped raise. As Thomas was leaving, Nora caught his arm. Bring her home, she said fiercely. Whatever it takes, bring our girl home. Thomas nodded, though he couldn't promise what he didn't control. He kissed Nora's forehead, then Claire's, breathing in the sweet baby smell of her, trying to memorize it in case this was the last time. Then he and Sylvia drove to Helena, toward the courthouse and the hearing that would decide Claire's fate. Vincent Ashford would be there, with his lawyers and his birth certificate and his legal rights. But Thomas would be there too, with Sylvia's truth and Grace's testimony and 6 months of devotion that had to count for something. They would fight. They would tell their story. And then they would wait for a judge to decide whether love or biology would win. The courthouse loomed ahead, grey and imposing against the spring sky. Thomas parked and sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, gathering his courage. Beside him, Sylvia was pale but determined. They looked at each other, two people who'd been broken by loss and violence, but who'd found strength in protecting something precious. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Sylvia took a deep breath. "For Claire." "I'm ready." They walked into the courthouse together, toward whatever judgment waited inside. The courtroom was smaller than Thomas had expected, paneled in dark wood with high windows that let in cold morning light. Judge Marlowe sat behind an elevated bench, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Vincent Ashford sat at the plaintiff's table with two lawyers flanking him, both in expensive suits that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month. Vincent himself looked polished and composed, nothing in his appearance suggesting the violence Sylvia had described. He wore a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, his dark hair perfectly combed, his expression one of patient righteousness. Thomas sat at the defense table with Malcolm Pierce, Sylvia beside him. She'd gone pale the moment they entered the courtroom and spotted Vincent. Her hands trembled in her lap until Thomas reached over and squeezed one gently. She gave him a weak smile, but didn't look in Vincent's direction again. The proceedings began with Judge Marlowe reviewing the documents before her. The birth certificate, Thomas's temporary guardianship order, the petition Vincent had filed for full custody. When she finished reading, she looked up and surveyed the courtroom with the kind of gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human behavior and was impressed by none of it. "This is a custody hearing, not a trial," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small space. "We're here to determine what arrangement serves the best interests of the minor child. Claire Elizabeth, born October 7th, 1947, Mr. Ashford. Your attorney may present your case." Vincent's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Merrick, rose smoothly. He was exactly the kind of lawyer money could buy, Thomas thought. Confident, articulate, with the kind of commanding presence that made you believe whatever he said must be true. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of parental rights," Merrick began. "Vincent Ashford is the biological father of Claire Elizabeth Ashford. This fact is documented and undisputed. He and the child's mother, Sylvia Hart, had a relationship that resulted in the child's birth. When Miss Hart abandoned the infant, leaving her with a stranger, Mr. Ashford immediately began searching for his daughter. He has now located her and is here to fulfill his rightful and legal obligation as her father." Merrick paced slightly as he spoke, his movements calculated for effect. "Mr. Brennan, while well-intentioned, has no biological or legal claim to this child beyond a temporary guardianship granted under the misapprehension that the parents were unknown. Now that Mr. Ashford has come forward, that guardianship should be terminated and custody returned to where it legally belongs. With the child's father, he painted Vincent as a concerned parent, a successful businessman with the means to provide an excellent life for Claire. He spoke of the home in Spokane, the nanny already hired, the private schools Vincent intended to enroll her in when she was old enough. He made it sound perfect, ideal, exactly what any child would want. And through it all, Vincent sat with his hands folded on the table, the picture of calm paternal devotion. Then Merrick called Vincent to testify. Vincent took the stand with easy confidence. Under Merrick's questioning, he painted himself as a victim of Sylvia's instability. Yes, they'd had a relationship. Yes, he was the father. But Sylvia had been erratic, prone to emotional outbursts and irrational decisions. When she'd discovered she was pregnant, she'd become paranoid, convinced he was trying to control her. He'd tried to help, to support her, but she'd refused. And then, one day she'd simply vanished, taking his unborn child with her. "I searched for months," Vincent said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine pain. "I hired investigators, checked hospitals, followed every lead. I was terrified that something had happened to Sylvia or the baby. When I finally found out that Sylvia had left our daughter in a barn in Montana, I was shocked. devastated. What kind of mother abandons her infant that way? Thomas watched this performance with growing anger. Vincent was good, he'd give him that. Every word carefully chosen, every expression perfectly calibrated to suggest a wronged father seeking justice. If you didn't know the truth, you'd believe him completely. Malcolm Pierce stood for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand with a deceptively casual air that Thomas recognized as the lawyer's courtroom strategy. Pierce liked to seem friendly, conversational, right up until he struck. "Mr. Ashford, you say Miss Hart was erratic and paranoid. Did you ever seek help for her? Professional help?" "I suggested it several times. She refused. Did you document these suggestions? Keep any records?" "No, I didn't think documentation would be necessary. She was my partner, not a patient." "Of course. And during the time Miss Hart was pregnant, you lived together?" "For a few months, yes." "And during those months, did you ever argue?" Vincent shifted slightly. "All couples argue. Physical arguments, Mr. Ashford?" "No, never." Pierce pulled a document from his file. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a police report from Helena, Montana, dated March 14th, 1947. It documents a noise complaint at an address where Mr. Ashford was residing at the time. Neighbors reported shouting and the sound of objects breaking. When police arrived, they noted visible disorder in the apartment, but no one would press charges." Merrick stood. "Your Honor, a noise complaint is hardly evidence of violence. And if no charges were filed, it's irrelevant to these proceedings. It establishes a pattern," Pierce countered. "A pattern we'll demonstrate through witness testimony." Judge Marlowe considered this. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Pierce." Pierce turned back to Vincent. "Mr. Ashford, you were arrested in Seattle in 1943 for assault. Can you explain the circumstances?" Vincent's jaw tightened. "That was a bar fight. The charges were dropped. It has nothing to do with my ability to parent. A bar fight where you broke another man's jaw. And in 1945, you were named in a restraining order filed by your second wife, Helen Ashford. She cited fear for her physical safety. That restraining order was withdrawn. My ex-wife and I resolved our differences. After she moved to California and you agreed not to contact her again, yes." Pierce let that hang in the air for a moment. "You have a pattern, Mr. Ashford. A pattern of violence toward women, of controlling behavior, of situations that end with the women in your life fleeing from you. Isn't that the real reason Miss Hart left? Not paranoia, but fear for her safety and her child's safety?" "That's a lie." Vincent's voice rose, and for just a moment Thomas saw something flash in his eyes, something dark and ugly. "Sylvia was unstable. She made up stories to justify her own inadequacies as a mother." "We'll let others speak to Miss Hart's character," Pierce said mildly. "No further questions." Vincent returned to his seat, his composure slightly cracked. Merrick leaned over and whispered something to him, and Vincent nodded, but his hands were clenched on the table now. Thomas saw it. The judge saw it, and he hoped it was enough to plant doubt. Pierce called Grace Patterson next. She took the stand nervously, her hands twisting in her lap, but her voice was clear and steady as she recounted everything Sylvia had told her. The charm that turned to control, the isolation, the violence that escalated with the pregnancy, the broken ribs and the bruises, the terror that had driven Sylvia to give birth in a boarding house rather than risk Vincent finding her in a hospital. Under Merrick's cross-examination, Grace held firm. He tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a friend of Sylvia's who'd concocted a story to help her evade parental responsibility. But Grace didn't waver. "I have no reason to lie," she said simply. "I barely knew Sylvia, but I know what it's like to be afraid of a man who's supposed to love you. I know what it takes to escape, and I know that woman was terrified for her baby's life. You don't give up your child unless you believe it's the only way to keep them safe." Then it was Sylvia's turn. She stood slowly, her legs visibly shaking, and walked to the witness stand. When she raised her right hand to be sworn in, Thomas could see how hard she was working to keep it steady. She sat down and finally, for the first time since entering the courtroom, looked directly at Vincent. He stared back at her with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Possessive, maybe, or threatening, like a man looking at something he considered his property and resented having taken away. Pierce began gently, establishing Sylvia's identity and her relationship to Claire. Then he asked her to tell the court what had happened between her and Vincent Ashford. Sylvia's voice was quiet at first, barely audible. The judge asked her to speak up, and she took a breath and started again. She told them about meeting Vincent, about how wonderful he'd seemed initially, how he'd made her feel safe and cared for after years of struggling alone. And then, haltingly, she told them about when things changed. It started small, she said. He'd get angry if I talked to other men, even just casual conversation. He'd check my pockets, go through my things, ask where I'd been every minute. He said it was because he loved me, because he wanted to protect me. I believed him at first. She described how the control tightened, how he'd isolated her from what few friends she had, how he'd convinced her to quit her job so she could focus on him and their future together, how without income of her own, she'd become completely dependent. When I got pregnant, I was happy. I thought maybe a baby would change things, would make him gentle again. Sylvia's voice broke. But it got worse. He was angry that I was tired, that I couldn't do everything I'd done before. He said I was getting fat, that I was disgusting, that he didn't know why he stayed with me. Judge Marlowe leaned forward. Miss Hart, did Mr. Ashford ever physically harm you? Sylvia nodded, tears streaming down her face now. Many times. He'd grab my arms hard enough to leave bruises. He'd push me against walls. Once when I was 5 months pregnant, we argued about money, and he hit me. I fell and I thought I was going to lose the baby. She looked directly at Vincent. That's when I knew I had to leave. That if I stayed, he'd kill me or Claire or both of us. The courtroom was silent. Even Merrick seemed momentarily at a loss for words. And that's why you left the baby with Mr. Brennan? Pierce asked gently. Yes, Vincent had told me that if I ever tried to leave, he'd find me. He said he had resources, connections, that he'd take Claire and make sure I never saw her again. He said no court would choose an unemployed, uneducated woman over a successful businessman. Sylvia wiped at her eyes. My sister Margaret used to talk about Thomas, about how good he was, how kind. She always said if she had children, she'd want them to have a father like him. When Claire was born and I knew I couldn't keep her safe, Thomas was the only person I could think of. The only person I trusted to protect her from Vincent. Pierce let that statement settle before asking his final question. Miss Hart, if the court grants custody to Mr. Brennan, what role would you want in Claire's life? Whatever role he'll allow me, Sylvia said softly. I don't expect to be her mother, not after what I did. But if I could see her sometimes, know she's safe and happy, that would be enough. Thomas is her father now. He's earned that. I just want to be part of her life, in whatever way keeps her safe. Merrick's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned every detail of Sylvia's story, suggested she was lying to cover her own abandonment of the child, implied she was mentally unstable and unreliable. He pointed out that she had no medical records of the abuse, no police reports, no documentation beyond her own word, and the hearsay testimony of Grace Patterson. Isn't it true, Miss Hart, that you abandoned your baby because you didn't want the responsibility of motherhood? That you made up these stories about abuse to justify your own failures? No, Sylvia's voice was stronger now. I gave her up to save her life. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, yet you're here now trying to take her back. I'm here to protect her from you, Sylvia said, looking straight at Vincent. I'm here to tell the truth about what you are. Vincent's control finally snapped. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud in the quiet courtroom. She's lying. Your Honor, this woman is mentally unstable. She abandoned our child, and now she's trying to paint me as a monster to cover her own guilt. Judge Marlowe's gavel cracked down. Mr. Ashford, you will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom. Merrick grabbed Vincent's arm and pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen the anger, the barely controlled rage that had broken through Vincent's careful facade. Pierce called Thomas last. Thomas took the stand feeling more nervous than he'd expected. He wasn't good with words, never had been. But as Pierce asked him to describe the last 6 months, Thomas found the words came easier than he'd thought. He talked about finding Claire in the barn, about learning to care for her, about the sleepless nights and the small victories. He talked about watching her grow, about her first smile and the way she laughed when he sang to her. He talked about the community that had rallied around them, about Nora's help and the neighbors who'd shown up with supplies and support. "Mr. Brennan, if the court grants you custody, what kind of life can you offer Claire?" Pierce asked. Thomas thought about his ranch, about the mountains and the horses, and the quiet life he'd built. "Not a fancy one," he admitted. "I can't offer private schools or nannies, but I can offer her a home where she's loved, where she's safe, where she'll grow up knowing she matters more than anything else in the world." He paused. "And I can offer her a relationship with her mother. Sylvia's not the enemy here. She's a woman who made an impossible choice to protect her child. If the court lets me keep Claire, Sylvia will always be welcome in our lives." Merrick's cross-examination focused on Thomas's capabilities as a single father running a ranch. Could he really provide adequate supervision? Could he balance the demands of ranch work with raising an infant? Wouldn't Claire be better off in a stable, two-parent home, or at least with her biological father, who had the resources to hire professional childcare? "Claire doesn't need professional childcare," Thomas said firmly. "She needs people who love her. She needs consistency and safety, and to know that the person caring for her will be there when she cries, when she's scared, when she needs comfort. I've been that person for 6 months. Vincent Ashford has been nothing but a name on a piece of paper and a threat to the woman who bore his child. You have no biological connection to this child." Merrick pressed. "No, but I have something more important. I have her trust. I have 6 months of showing up every single day, and I have the willingness to fight for her, even against a system that says biology matters more than love." When the testimony concluded, Judge Marlowe called a recess to review the evidence and testimonies. Thomas, Sylvia, and Pierce waited in a small room down the hall. The minutes stretched into an hour. Sylvia paced, while Thomas sat with his head in his hands, trying not to think about what would happen if they lost. Trying not to imagine handing Claire over to Vincent, watching her be carried away by a man who'd terrorized her mother. Finally, a clerk appeared and told them the judge was ready. They filed back into the courtroom. Vincent was already seated, his expression confident again. He clearly believed he'd won. After all, he had the law on his side. He had biology. He had resources. What did Thomas have but love? And when had that ever been enough? Judge Marlowe settled into her chair and looked out at the courtroom. Her expression gave nothing away. "I've reviewed all the testimony and evidence presented today," she began. "This is not an easy case. On one hand, we have a biological father with legal documentation and the financial means to provide for a child. On the other, we have a man who has cared for this infant for 6 months, and a mother who alleges she fled from abuse." She paused. "In custody cases, the paramount concern is the best interest of the child. Not the rights of the parents, not what seems fair, but what serves the child's welfare." Thomas's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear over it. "Mr. Ashford, your documentation is impeccable. Your financial resources are substantial. But I have concerns about your fitness as a parent. Your history of violence, documented through arrest records and restraining orders, cannot be ignored. Your behavior in this courtroom today, when you lost your composure, demonstrates a temper that gives me pause." She looked directly at Vincent. Miss Hart's testimony, corroborated by Miss Patterson, paints a picture of a man who uses control and violence to dominate the women in his life. Whether or not every detail is proven beyond doubt, the pattern is troubling. Vincent started to speak, but Merrick put a hand on his arm, silencing him. "More importantly," the judge continued, "I must consider what is best for Claire. She is 6 months old. For the last 6 of those months, she has been cared for by Mr. Brennan. He has been her primary caregiver, the person she bonds with, the one who provides her stability and security. To remove her from that environment and place her with someone she has no relationship with, regardless of biological connection, would be traumatic. Thomas felt hope rising in his chest, almost painful in its intensity. Furthermore, I'm moved by Miss Hart's testimony and her willingness to prioritize her daughter's well-being over her own parental rights. A mother who gives up her child to protect her from danger demonstrates more parental fitness than one who clings to custody out of pride or possessiveness. Judge Marlowe picked up her gavel. I am denying Mr. Ashford's petition for custody. I'm extending Mr. Brennan's guardianship and recommending that he petition for full adoption. Miss Hart's parental rights will remain intact, with liberal visitation as arranged between her and Mr. Brennan. This arrangement serves the best interest of the child and provides her with stability, safety, and a relationship with both the man who has raised her and the mother who sacrificed to protect her. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo forever. Thomas sat frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. They'd won. Claire was his. She was staying with him. Beside him, Sylvia had started crying, her hands over her face. Pierce was smiling, gathering his documents. And across the aisle, Vincent Ashford sat rigid with fury, his face dark with rage. This is a travesty, Vincent hissed, standing abruptly. That child is mine by blood. You can't just give her to a stranger because he's charmed you with his country act. Judge Marlowe's expression turned to ice. Mr. Ashford, I can and I have. If you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will hold you in contempt. This hearing is concluded. Thomas stood on shaking legs. It was over. Claire was his, really truly his. He turned to Sylvia and pulled her into a hug, feeling her sob against his shoulder. Pierce clapped him on the back, saying something congratulatory that Thomas barely heard over the roaring in his ears. They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunshine that felt like a benediction. Thomas stopped on the steps and tilted his face up to the sky, breathing in deep, free. They were free. Claire was safe. We should call Nora, Sylvia said, wiping at her eyes. Tell her the news. They found a phone booth a block away, and Thomas called the ranch with hands that still trembled. Nora answered on the first ring. Thomas, what happened? Is Claire... We won, Thomas said, his voice breaking. She's ours, Nora. She's coming home. Nora's sob of relief came clearly through the line. In the background, Thomas could hear Claire babbling, completely unaware that her whole future had just been secured. Come home, Nora said. Come home to your daughter. They drove back to Montana as the sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas drove while Sylvia sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the landscape with an expression of stunned relief. Neither of them said much. There were no words big enough for what had just happened, for the weight that had been lifted, for the future that had suddenly opened up before them. When they pulled up to the ranch, Nora was waiting on the porch with Claire in her arms. The baby saw Thomas and broke into a huge smile, reaching for him with both hands. Thomas climbed the steps and took her, holding her tight against his chest, breathing in the familiar smell of her. Hey there, little one, he whispered. Daddy's home, and I'm never letting you go. Behind him, Sylvia stood at the bottom of the steps, watching. Nora came down and put an arm around her shoulders. Come inside, she said gently. Your family now. This is your home too, and together, all of them. They walked into the ranch house where Claire would grow up. Safe, loved, home. Part 7, Building Home from Broken Pieces Summer, came to Montana with the smell of wild sage and the sound of meadowlarks singing at dawn. Thomas stood at the fence line, Claire strapped to his back in the carrier, watching the new foals race across the south pasture. The baby had grown strong over the past 2 months since the hearing, her legs kicking against his ribs as she bounced with excitement at the horses. She'd started making sounds that were almost words now, and when Thomas turned his head to look at her, she grabbed his ear and laughed, delighted with herself. Life had found a new rhythm in the weeks since they'd returned from Helena. Sylvia had moved into the spare bedroom. the one Thomas had used for storage since Margaret died. Together, he and Nora had cleared it out, painting the walls a soft blue and bringing in furniture from Iris Calloway's store. It wasn't much, just a bed and a dresser and a small table by the window. But Sylvia had cried when she saw it, touched that someone would make a space for her after all the years of having nowhere to belong. The first days had been awkward. Sylvia moved through the house like a ghost, uncertain of her place, afraid to impose. She'd wake before dawn and have breakfast made before Thomas came downstairs. She'd clean things that didn't need cleaning and apologize for taking up space. It took nearly a week before Thomas finally sat her down at the kitchen table and spoke plain. "This is your home, Sylvia, not a place you're visiting, not somewhere you need to earn your keep. You're Claire's mother and Margaret's sister, and that means your family. Family doesn't apologize for existing." She'd looked at him with those eyes so like Margaret's and asked quietly, "What if I don't know how to be family anymore? Then we'll learn together." And slowly, carefully they had. Sylvia began spending more time with Claire, at first just holding her while Thomas did chores, then feeding her bottles, changing diapers, singing lullabies in a voice that grew steadier each day. Claire responded to her mother with the same easy affection she showed everyone, reaching for Sylvia's hair and gurgling contentedly in her arms. There was no confusion in the baby about who was who. Thomas was the constant, the primary caregiver, the person she turned to when tired or frightened. But Sylvia was becoming part of her world too, a gentle presence who smelled like lavender and hummed old songs while rocking her to sleep. Nora came by most mornings still, though her visits had changed character. She and Sylvia had become friends, two women who understood what it meant to rebuild yourself after men had tried to break you. They'd sit on the porch with coffee and Claire playing on a blanket between them, talking about small things and large ones, about the past and the future and the strange gift of second chances. One morning in late June, Thomas came back from checking the north fence to find the three of them in the kitchen garden Nora and Sylvia had planted. They'd turned a patch of earth behind the house into neat rows of vegetables. And now Sylvia knelt in the dirt with Claire on her lap, both of them covered in soil, while Nora directed the planting with the authority of someone who'd grown up on a farm. Thomas leaned against the fence and watched them, feeling something warm settle in his chest. This, he thought, this was what Margaret would have wanted. Not perfection, not the fairy tale ending, but this complicated, messy, beautiful thing they were building together. A family made from broken pieces, held together by choice and commitment and love that didn't need blood to make it real. Claire's first birthday arrived in October, exactly 1 year after Thomas had found her crying in his barn. They celebrated with a small party, just family and close friends. Iris brought a cake decorated with a single pink candle. The Westfield brothers gave Claire a wooden rocking horse Danny had carved, smooth and perfect. Reverend Hayes said a blessing over the meal, and Nora presented Thomas with the adoption papers Malcolm Pierce had filed, official and stamped, making Claire Brennan his daughter in the eyes of the law as she'd always been in his heart. Sylvia had made Claire a dress from fabric she'd bought in town, pale yellow with tiny embroidered flowers along the hem. When she'd shown it to Thomas, he'd seen her hands shake slightly, nervous that he might think she was overstepping. But he'd only smiled and said it was perfect, which it was. They gathered around the kitchen table as Claire sat in the high chair Cole had built, her face serious with concentration as she examined the cake before her. When everyone sang, she looked around with wide eyes, startled by all the attention. Then Nora helped her blow out the candle, and Claire laughed and clapped her hands, delighted by the smoke curling upward. Thomas cut the cake and handed out slices, but he couldn't eat. He kept looking at Claire, at this little person who'd appeared in his life like a miracle he hadn't known to pray for. 1 year ago, he'd been alone, frozen in grief, going through the motions of living without really being alive. And now his house was full of voices and laughter, his days full of purpose, his heart full of something that felt like hope. Later, after everyone had gone home, and Claire had fallen asleep, sticky with frosting and exhausted from attention. Thomas sat on the porch in the gathering dusk. Nora came out and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They'd been moving toward this for months, this thing between them that neither had named, but both understood. It wasn't what he'd had with Margaret. That had been young love, passionate and all-consuming. This was different, quieter, built on friendship and shared purpose and the deep comfort of being known. "Thank you," Thomas said into the darkness. "For what?" "For showing up. That first day, when I had no idea what I was doing, and every day since. For helping me become someone capable of this." He gestured toward the house, toward the life inside it. Nora took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "You were always capable, Thomas. You just needed a reason to remember." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one above the mountains. Inside, Thomas could hear Sylvia moving around the kitchen, washing dishes and humming softly. The sound of home, the sound of family, the sound of everything he'd thought he'd lost forever, but had somehow found again in the most unexpected way. As autumn deepened and winter approached, the ranch prepared for the cold months ahead. Thomas worked long days with Cole and Danny, moving cattle to winter pasture, stockpiling hay, reinforcing the barn against the snow that would inevitably come. Claire rode with him through it all, bundled in layers, her dark eyes taking in everything. She'd started walking now, wobbling around the house with her arms out for balance, falling constantly, but always getting back up with fierce determination. She had Thomas's stubbornness, Sylvia said, and Margaret's spirit. Sylvia had found work at the school in Clearwater, helping in the library 3 days a week. It wasn't much, but it gave her income of her own and a sense of purpose beyond motherhood. She'd blossom when she talked about the books she was cataloguing, the children she helped find stories. Thomas watched her slowly become herself again, whoever that self was, beneath the fear and trauma Vincent had buried her under. They'd heard nothing from Vincent Ashford since the hearing. Malcolm Pierce had warned them that he might appeal, might try again to claim custody, but months had passed with no word. Either he'd accepted defeat or he'd moved on to easier prey. Thomas hoped it was the former, but suspected it was the latter. Men like Vincent didn't change. They just found new victims. One evening in November, a letter arrived addressed to Thomas in handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it at the kitchen table while Sylvia prepared dinner and Claire played with wooden blocks on the floor. Inside was a single page, brief and to the point. It was from Helen Ashford, Vincent's second wife, the one who'd filed the restraining order. She wrote that she'd heard about the custody case through mutual acquaintances. She wanted Thomas to know that he'd done the right thing fighting for Claire. She wrote about her own experience with Vincent, about the charm that hid cruelty, about the control that had nearly destroyed her. She'd escaped but carried the scars still. She ended by saying that some children were lucky to have people who fought for them, who saw danger and chose to stand between it and innocence. Claire was lucky, she wrote, and she hoped Thomas knew that. Thomas folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his desk drawer with Sylvia's original note. Someday, when Claire was older, he'd tell her the whole story. About the mother who'd loved her enough to let her go, about the man she'd been protected from, about the people who'd come together to keep her safe. But for now, she was just a baby playing on the floor, oblivious to the battles that had been fought on her behalf. "Everything all right?" Sylvia asked, glancing over from the stove. "Everything's fine." Thomas picked Claire up and tossed her gently in the air, catching her as she squealed with delight. "Everything's better than fine." Winter settled over the ranch with its usual severity. Snow piled high against the barn walls and turned the world into something pristine and silent. Thomas spent his days keeping paths clear and animals fed, while inside the house, Sylvia and Nora created warmth through cooking and quilting and the small domestic rituals that made a house feel like home. Claire experienced her first real snow with wonder, pressing her small hands against the cold window glass. Mesmerized by the falling flakes, on Christmas morning, they gathered around the same small tree Thomas had decorated the year before. But this year, there were more gifts, More laughter, more life filling the spaces that had been empty. Claire tore into packages with the enthusiasm of a child who didn't quite understand what was happening, but enjoyed the chaos anyway. She received a stuffed rabbit from Nora, new clothes from Sylvia, and from Thomas, a small wooden box he'd made himself with Claire's name carved into the lid. For keeping treasures, he explained, knowing she couldn't understand yet, but wanting to give her something made by his hands, something that would last. Sylvia gave Thomas a gift too, wrapped carefully in brown paper. Inside was a photograph in a handmade frame. She'd found it in some old boxes, a picture of Thomas and Margaret from years ago, young and laughing on their wedding day. Below it, she'd carefully mounted a newer photograph of Thomas and Claire, taken just last month, the two of them in the barn with the horses. Past and present, side by side. I thought you should have both, Sylvia said quietly. All the people who made you who you are. Thomas couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. He set the frame on the mantel where he could see it every day. Margaret smiling from one photo, Claire smiling from the other. The wife he'd lost and the daughter he'd found. Both precious, both part of him. That night, after Claire had been put to bed and Sylvia had retired to her room, Thomas and Nora sat by the fire. The house was warm and quiet, peaceful in the way that only comes after a day full of joy. Nora leaned against Thomas's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I've been thinking," Nora said softly. About this, us, what we're building here." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "I know it's complicated. I know you loved Margaret and you always will. I'm not trying to replace her." "You're not," Thomas said firmly. "You're something new, something I didn't know I needed but can't imagine living without now. I love Claire," Nora continued, "and I love what we've become together, the three of us. Four, counting Sylvia. This strange, complicated family we've made." She hesitated. "I guess what I'm asking is there room in this family for one more, permanently?" Thomas understood what she was asking. He thought about it carefully, not because he doubted his feelings, but because he wanted to be sure he was being fair to everyone involved. To Nora, who deserved more than being second choice. To Claire, who deserved stability. To Sylvia, who deserved a say in how their household evolved. And to Margaret's memory, which he'd honor by living fully rather than remaining frozen in grief. "There's room," he said finally, "if you're sure this is what you want. A ready-made family and a rancher who still doesn't always know what he's doing." Nora smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. "I've never been more sure of anything." They married in the spring, a simple ceremony in the ranch house with Reverend Hayes officiating and a handful of close friends as witnesses. Claire toddled between them in the yellow dress Sylvia had made, carrying a basket of wildflowers and dropping petals haphazardly on the floor. Sylvia stood as Nora's witness and Cole Westfield stood as Thomas's, and when the Reverend pronounced them married, the small group erupted in applause and laughter. The ranch house that had been so empty just 18 months ago now overflowed with life. Thomas and Nora took the master bedroom, the one he'd avoided since Margaret's death. They painted it a soft green and bought a new bed, creating something that belonged to them rather than to the past. Sylvia stayed in her room and Claire had the nursery, though she spent most nights climbing out of her crib and padding into one room or another to sleep curled against whoever would have her. Spring turned to summer, and the rhythm of ranch life carried them forward. Claire grew from baby to toddler to a small person with opinions and preferences, and a stubborn streak that made Thomas laugh and shake his head in equal measure. She loved the horses and would stand at the fence calling to them in her limited vocabulary, convinced they understood every word. She followed Thomas everywhere, her small shadow, insisting on helping with chores she was far too little to accomplish. Sylvia bloomed too. She took on more hours at the library and started writing, small pieces for the local newspaper about books and education. She dated occasionally, careful men who treated her gently, though nothing serious developed. She seemed content with her life as it was, with her place in their unconventional family. with being Claire's mother in ways that didn't require her to be the primary parent, and Thomas, who had spent 3 years believing his life was over, found himself fully alive again. The grief for Margaret never disappeared entirely. It surfaced in unexpected moments, when he heard a song she'd loved or smelled a perfume that reminded him of her. But alongside the grief was gratitude for what they'd had, and acceptance that life continued. That love didn't end just because one form of it did. On a warm evening in August, 2 years after finding Claire in the barn, Thomas sat on the porch with his family around him. Nora was reading, her feet propped on the railing. Sylvia was teaching Claire to braid dandelion stems into chains. The sun sank toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Thomas thought about the man he'd been before Claire arrived, the emptiness he'd carried, the way he'd moved through days without really living them. How the ranch had been just a place to work until exhaustion made him numb enough to sleep. He thought about the morning he'd heard crying from the barn and almost ignored it, almost convinced himself it was nothing worth investigating. What if he hadn't gone up to the loft? What if he'd driven into town a day earlier or later and missed Iris Calloway's help? What if Judge Marlowe had ruled differently? His entire life now balanced on a series of small choices and lucky accidents that could have gone another way so easily. But they hadn't. Claire had been left in his barn for reasons he'd never fully understand, and he'd chosen over and over to show up for her. And that choice had led to this, to a porch full of people he loved and who loved him back, to a house that rang with laughter instead of echoing with silence, to a future he actually wanted to see. Claire abandoned her dandelion chains and climbed into Thomas's lap, sticky fingers grabbing at his shirt. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that were beginning to look more like her own and less like anyone else's, and said with perfect clarity, "Love you, Daddy." 3 simple words that contained everything. Thomas kissed the top of her head and held her close, breathing in the smell of sun and grass and the particular sweetness of childhood. "Love you too, little one." More than all the stars, Nora glanced over and smiled. Sylvia watched her daughter with an expression of peaceful contentment. The evening birds called from the pines. A horse whinnied from the pasture. Somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled, promising rain later, and Thomas Brennan, who had once been so broken he couldn't imagine healing, felt whole. The years passed the way they do when life is full. Claire started school, learning to read with the same fierce determination she applied to everything. She helped with the ranch work, graduating from riding in the carrier to sitting her own small saddle, to eventually handling the horses with a competence that made Thomas proud beyond words. She called Thomas Daddy and Nora, Mama Nora, and Sylvia simply Mom, and seemed to find nothing unusual about having multiple parents who loved her in different ways. Sylvia eventually met someone, a teacher at the school who understood about past trauma and didn't push for more than she was ready to give. They courted slowly, respectfully, and when they married 3 years after the custody hearing, it was with Claire as flower girl and Thomas walking Sylvia down the aisle. She moved into a small house in Clearwater, but came to the ranch most weekends, maintaining her place in Claire's life while building one of her own. Thomas and Nora's life together was marked by small joys rather than grand dramas. They worked the ranch side by side, added 2 more children to their family in the years that followed, and created the kind of steady, loving home that looked ordinary from the outside but felt miraculous to everyone inside it. The walls of the house are filled with photographs chronicling Claire's growth and her siblings' arrivals, documenting school plays and county fairs and ordinary Sundays that became precious simply because they were shared. On Claire's 10th birthday, Thomas gave her the wooden box he'd made when she was 1, now filled with items he'd saved. Sylvia's original note, worn soft at the creases. The birth certificate that had almost taken her away. The court documents granting Thomas guardianship. Photographs of her first year. Helen Ashford's letter. All the pieces of her origin story, complicated and painful and ultimately beautiful. "This is where you came from," Thomas said as they sat together in the evening light. "All the hard things, and the brave things, and the love that brought you here." Claire examined each item carefully, old enough now to understand what they meant. When she reached the note, she read it slowly, her lips moving over the words. Then she looked up at Thomas, her expression serious. "She loved me enough to give me to you." "Yes. And you loved me enough to fight for me." "Yes." Claire was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she put everything back in the box and closed the lid, her fingers tracing the carved letters of her name. "I'm glad," she said simply. "I'm glad everything happened the way it did, even the scary parts, because it led to this." Thomas pulled her close. "This girl who'd started as a crying infant in a barn and grown into a strong, thoughtful child who understood more about love and sacrifice than most adults." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." That night, Thomas stood at the fence line where he'd stood so many times before, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. But this time he wasn't alone. Nora stood beside him, her hand in his. Behind them, the house glowed with warm light from the windows. Inside were their children, safe and asleep. Inside was everything that mattered. Thomas thought about the man he'd been, standing in this same spot years ago, hollow with grief and seeing no way forward. If he could speak to that man now, what would he say? That life continued. That love returned in unexpected forms. That the deepest pain could transform into the deepest joy if you stayed open to possibility. Maybe all of that, or maybe just this: don't give up. Even when the world feels empty and cold, and you can't imagine ever feeling whole again, don't give up. Because you never know when grace might appear, crying in a barn, needing you as much as you need to be needed. "What are you thinking about?" Nora asked softly. Thomas turned to look at her, at this woman who'd shown up when he needed help and stayed to build a life, at the house full of the family they'd created together from such broken beginnings. He thought about Margaret and hoped she could see what had grown from the grief of losing her. He thought about Sylvia and the impossible courage it took to give up everything to save what mattered most. He thought about Claire and all the small moments that had led to this one. "I'm thinking," he said, pulling Nora close, "that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, and standing there beneath the vast Montana sky, surrounded by everything he'd lost and everything he'd found." Thomas Brennan finally understood a truth that had taken years to learn. Family wasn't about blood or biology or legal documents. It was about showing up, about choosing to love even when it was hard, about taking broken pieces and building something whole. It was about a baby left in a barn and the man who'd heard her crying and decided to care. It was about second chances and unexpected grace and the stubborn refusal to give up on the possibility of joy. It was about home, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful glory, and they had built it together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.